And you are looking at live images outside of the Dedham Courthouse, where court is in break after Brian Walshe pleaded guilty to 2 lesser charges in the murder case of his wife, Anna. He pleaded guilty to lying to investigators as well as conveying or moving a body. Chris Tanaka alongside Paula Eben welcoming you back as we get ready to speak with WBZ legal analyst Jennifer Roman.
And Chris, before jury selection began, that is when he changed his plea. The judge said he will not be sentenced to those charges today, that he is pleading guilty. We want to turn to attorney Jennifer Roman. Jennifer, I want to make sure you can hear us.
I can, thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us. What's the strategy here?
Yeah, this is a really interesting shift in the defense strategy. It appears that they're hoping that Brian Walshe will be able to plead to a lesser charge than first-degree murder so that he would have the possibility of parole. It's important to note that a defendant cannot plead guilty to first-degree murder, and it's a mandatory sentence of life without parole. So here, where the prosecution doesn't have a body, which is a challenge for them to overcome in this case, if Brian Walshe is taking some responsibility for his involvement, I wouldn't be surprised if there's behind the scenes discussions about whether or not the prosecution will reduce the charge of first-degree murder, which would then allow him to plead guilty and preserve a right of parole for him.
How important is it to have the body when the prosecution, Jennifer, has detailed in their court paperwork mountains of circumstantial evidence starting on January 1st with Google searches, cell phone location of Brian Walshe's older child, surveillance video from Lowe's where Brian is seen buying lots of cleaning devices, I believe in one instance a saw, several tarps. Does the prosecution need the body to prove murder?
They don't need the body to prove murder. Prosecutions have succeeded before on murder charges without ever recovering the body. But it's sort of that final piece in the puzzle that seals this all up for the prosecution. So it is a weakness. It's not an insurmountable weakness, but it does exist. And here, they might want to have a proverbial bird in hand and secure a conviction rather than take the chances that at trial, an expensive and lengthy trial for the Commonwealth, that anything can happen.
So Brian Walshe maintains his innocence on count 1, the murder of Anna Walshe, but by admitting to misleading police and conveying or, moving a dead body, how difficult is that leap to make once you have people on the stand? Do you think he would ever testify?
No, he won't testify. I mean, it's too risky. I mean, he won't testify. He doesn't need to. It's the prosecution's burden. But yes, these charges that he's pleading guilty to, what's the theory of the case going to be? That she died unexpectedly in the home, and rather than call the authorities, he relocated the body. Prosecution says dismembered the body. There was a lot of blood, on carpeting, and her belongings are found in various dumpsters. So why would you go through that effort if somebody just unexpectedly died in your home? That's not a normal response.
So you're saying he's just trying to preserve the possibility of parole. That's about it at this point?
That's about it. And if there's any chance that the prosecution would agree to him pleading guilty to a second-degree murder charge rather than having to take this to a first-degree murder trial, he wants to try.
Yeah.
He wants to try.
And so from the prosecution side, Jennifer, how much do external factors weigh in on cases like this? Specifically, we've seen this courthouse nationally with the Karen Read trial, 2 go-arounds. You mentioned lengthy and costly for the state, 2 go-arounds of lengthy and costly Karen Read trials. Does the Norfolk County District Attorney's Office just want to get, as you said, this bird in hand and secure a high-profile prosecution after 2 recent failures?
Yeah, the Norfolk County DA's office is definitely licking its wounds a little bit after the Karen Read trial 1 and 2. It garnered so much attention, and that was a real disappointment for the prosecution. So in a case like this, where we've got children who are now motherless and are going, if there's a conviction, they're going to be fatherless too. How much do you try to just help people move on and secure the conviction, rather than try to make a point that it's really first-degree murder? And that's a subjective call that the prosecution needs to make.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so what do you expect moving forward? Again, the judge had said no sentencing today. They just proceed with jury selection. Will they just continue on knowing these two indictments he has pled guilty to? How do they proceed from here?
Right. The jury selection will continue. If the trial goes forward, the judge would likely delay the sentencing on those two lesser charges that he's pled guilty to until the time of judgment in the trial. Because if he is in fact convicted of first-degree murder, the pleading guilty to these two lesser charges doesn't mean much in terms of a sentence, because he would be convicted. If he was convicted, it's life without parole on the murder charge. If he's acquitted, then there could be some prison time on these two lesser charges, which is why I think the judge will defer until the conclusion of the murder trial.
Take us inside the defense attorney's mindset here. What is the most likely, in your expert opinion, charge that they would want to plead into if they were trading with the prosecution? Well,
the defense's best bet would be an involuntary manslaughter charge. I don't know if it doesn't seem like there's the facts to really support that, but maybe that's part of the defense theory, that there was some sort of reckless or wanton conduct that was sort of an involuntary, he didn't premeditate the murder or the killing. That would be their best bet. I think what's more realistic and what's more likely, given the strengths of the Commonwealth's case, is going to be that he pleads to a second-degree murder charge rather than first-degree, which would allow him to preserve his rights to parole.
And after that pretrial hearing yesterday, Jennifer, in which prosecutors said they had the binders full of evidence, do you think either the attorney said to him, we got to talk about this, or this is something they had pre-planned?
I think it was more pre-planned. I don't think anything they're doing is off the cuff. I think this is a very strategic defense team, and they've probably been having these discussions with Brian Walshe for quite some time about what the possibilities are and how they may be able to protect his ability for release and what that might mean. And I think that this plea to these two lesser charges is a really strong signal that that's the direction they're going. Let's try to minimize the damage to you, Brian Walshe, because the Commonwealth's case is what it is. Our defense is what it is. What happens next? We never know with a jury of 12 people what can happen. And I think that's a concern for the prosecution, and it's a concern for the defense.
All right, Jennifer, we want you to stay with us. We have to take a quick break, but we have many more questions on the other side of it. We're going to step aside for approximately 2 minutes. We're going to be right back. More questions from Jennifer Roman as court remains in break after Brian Walshe's two pleads of guilty.
Yeah, big headline. He has changed his plea this morning. We'll be back with more right after this. Following breaking news for you this morning, Brian Walshe has changed his plea from not guilty to guilty on two charges: misleading a police investigation and conveying a dead body.
Absolutely. Of course, the murder charge still stands as jury selection has gotten underway. We want to bring in WBZ legal analyst Jennifer Roman to clear the air on some of the questions that naturally arise when something like this happens. First things first, Jennifer, what does it mean with these two changes of plea?
Yeah, this appears to be a change in strategy on the defense's part, and I think it's a really smart strategy. By having Brian Walshe plead guilty to these lesser two charges, it shows that he's assuming some responsibility for his conduct, but also would give them the option or the opportunity to speak with the prosecution about reducing the murder charge to, say, a second-degree murder or maybe even a manslaughter charge, which would allow Brian Walshe to preserve the possibility of parole. A defendant cannot plead guilty first-degree murder. So long as those first-degree murder charges are standing, it would have to go to trial, and there's an automatic right to an appeal after a conviction of first-degree murder. So on one hand, by taking responsibility of these lesser two charges, it's not too much of a leap for a jury to think that he actually did commit the murder. But if they can reduce those charges to something less, which would help Brian Walshe on the tail end if he was, by accepting responsibility, that seems to be what the defense wants to do.
So it's your belief that he's doing this to preserve the possibility of parole, and you had indicated that you think this is probably a strategy they've been talking to Brian Walshe about behind the scenes for some time, considering the fact that the prosecution has amassed so much evidence against him.
Yeah, the prosecution evidence is strong, but they still do have the weakness of not having the actual body. Here, Brian Walshe, by pleading to these lesser charges, is signaling to the prosecution a willingness to accept responsibility, at least for some actions on the night that the prosecution alleges she was murdered. And that responsibility is signaling to the prosecution he wants to talk. And if the prosecution is willing to reduce the charges, I very well expect we would see a plea of guilty to a lesser charge other than first-degree murder.
With those lesser charges, do they carry similar penalties in terms of incarceration time?
On a second-degree murder charge, he could still be sentenced to life in prison. However, he would have the possibility of parole. On a first-degree murder conviction, he does not have the possibility of parole. So a life sentence is truly a life sentence.
Yeah. And of course, there's a lot of strategy that goes into this, not just for the defense, but the prosecution, which for the county has weathered some bad publicity over two recent high-profile trials of Karen Reed.
Yeah, it's true, especially since we have Michael Proctor, a factor in this case as well. I mean, is this one of their considerations?
Yeah, the prosecution is definitely, I would think, licking their wounds a bit after the Karen Reed trials. That was a big blow to the Norfolk District Attorney's Office. And while they treat every case differently and they try to assess every case, I can't help but think that that's on their mind. And securing a conviction without the risk of a trial, every trial has a risk. It doesn't matter how strong your case is as a prosecution, there's always a risk that the jury of 12 is not going to see it the way that you want them to. And so for them to secure a conviction of, let's say, a second-degree murder with, the sentence of life, life with the possibility of parole, that might seem pretty appealing to them as the Commonwealth, particularly considering in a first-degree murder case that there's an automatic right to appeal. So this case would not be over even if a conviction was secured. They'd still have to go through the appellate process.
Interesting. So the court of law and court of public perception in this case and many others, two very different things.
Very, very different.
Yeah.
And so the jury selection is expected to get underway. Court is in a break at the moment. For those who are not in courtrooms, what happens next?
Sure. So the jurors will come into the courtroom. Every juror has filled out a questionnaire to try to assess at least obvious bias or inability to serve as an impartial juror, or if they have some sort of major scheduling issue. For example, if a woman's pregnant and she's expected to deliver in the next 2 weeks, well, she's not going to be able to sit on the jury. And then the prosecution and the defense both have an opportunity to move to strike a certain number of the jurors. And they do that, assessing sort of what the jurors say on the jury voir dire, where the judge asks a series of questions to understand whether or not that juror can truly be impartial and meet their responsibility of sitting for the length of this trial. And then we start to get jurors impaneled one by one until we have a pool. The target pool is 16, so that we can have 2 alternates and then 2 additional people on the jury. As we saw with Karen Reed, those alternates do become it's likely that they'll become a critical part of the case because things happen and jurors sometimes have to be removed or sometimes cannot fulfill their duty.
Okay, and we just want to reiterate that jury selection is expected to begin soon. Our Penny Commit is covering this trial. She's inside the courtroom. We have word that Walshe has re-entered the courtroom. However, the court's camera feed still not back up.
Right. For the judge, she reiterated that she didn't believe there was any impediment to accepting these 2 pleas from 50-year-old Brian Walshe, Judge Frenier, and again, not sentencing him today. This will wait until the rest rest of the trial gets underway. That jury selection expected to begin in another few minutes. By accepting some responsibility here, Jennifer, I think a lot of observers at home just watching this trial will wonder, well, if you've admitted to moving a dead body and then misleading investigators, really how much needs to be said once the prosecution gets underway?
Well, it would open up a new theory of the case for the defense team. I mean, the defense could argue that there was an unexpected death, that Anna Walshe, maybe she mixed, maybe it was New Year's Eve, so maybe she drank too much and mixed it with some prescription medications, which had an unexpected result. I think they're going to shift. They're going to shift it to she died unexpectedly, he panicked, and this is what he did. Whether or not that's going to work, I think, depends on how the other evidence comes in from the prosecution. And it doesn't address those Google searches that Brian Walshe is alleged to have made about how long before a body decomposes, how to dispose of a body. Those are really damning searches for him. And so it becomes this question of, can the defense say, well, no, that was part of his panic. Right? She died unexpectedly. He didn't know what to do. He was trying to assess his options. Is that plausible to a jury, or does that not sit with them as a plausible explanation?
Yeah. Hey, Jennifer, as lay people, we sit here and we watch these courtroom proceedings, and when there's a change of plea, it naturally perks up our ears. But you have used the terms smart, strategic. How surprising or unsurprising is this to you?
I do think that this did come as a surprise, but I think if my theory is right, that this is part of a larger strategy to try to preserve the possibility of parole for Brian Walshe. I know that his defense team wouldn't have done this unless they really thought it could potentially be helpful to him. They're not going to do anything that could potentially hurt him in the long run. And so what would not surprise me now that we've seen this plea deal come through on these two lesser charges is that there is a discussion ongoing with the prosecution about potentially accepting a plea deal on a lower charge than first-degree murder.
Jury selection is such an art, not really a science, Jennifer, but in your experience, obviously you always want to select people who make clear-cut decisions, usually who have careers where precise thinking is involved. What kind of a juror would you be looking for if you were on his defense team?
If I'm on the defense team, I'm trying to stay away from those stay-at-home moms or a stay-at-home parent who is the primary caregiver for their children. I'm probably looking for somebody who may be divorced, because part of this defense theory so far has been marital troubles doesn't equate murder. And so I'm looking for somebody who might have some empathy and insight into that, hey, maybe your marriage doesn't work out, but it doesn't mean you have so much ill will or hatred towards somebody that you're actually going to kill them. So those are the kinds of people that I'm looking for. I'm also looking for somebody who might be skeptical of law enforcement. So I don't want anybody who has family or extended family that's in law enforcement. I want somebody who could really look at this case and decide whether or not the police and the investigators did a thorough investigation, as opposed to jumping to conclusions that Brian Walshe was the only possible perpetrator, because I think that's also going to be part of the defense theory, is that there was a rush to judgment here.
Yeah, and without being insincere towards the family of Anna Walshe, when we talk about this case in the absence of a body, how does the prosecution get this over the finish line?
Right. The prosecution's going to have to be really methodical and really weave this story together for the jurors. And they're going to start with every little bit of circumstantial evidence that they have. And they have a lot of it. And there's also some direct evidence that suggests that Brian Walshe was involved in some way with her death. And we sort of wonder, how much does that admitting to just obstructing justice and obstructing the police investigation and moving the body plays into some of that circumstantial evidence that the prosecution's going to rely heavily on. Prosecution's going to rely on those surveillance photos and video from Home Depot where he's seen buying cleaning supplies and a hacksaw and bleach and goggles and gloves and tape, all of these things that we think, why is somebody buying that? That's craziness. Why are they buying that, particularly on a night when his wife goes missing or a few days later? And so the defense knows the prosecution's going to rely heavily on that. So in another strategy position, possibly, the defense is saying, if we can negate that, if we can say, yeah, he bought those things because he panicked, as opposed to he bought those things because he murdered her and then was trying to dispose of the body, they've somehow taken some of the wind out of the prosecution's sails. So the prosecution's going to have to try really hard to weave all of these bits and pieces of circumstantial evidence and some of the direct evidence. There was Anna and Brian Walshe's DNA inside his vehicle. So is there an explanation for that? We don't necessarily know how long DNA has been sitting there in a car or anywhere for that matter. So they're really going to have to sort of walk the jury through their theory of the case and tighten up some of those potentially loose ends to say that he actually did this. Right. And I think they can be successful in that if they do it carefully and if the evidence comes in the way that we're expecting it to come in. But then we've also got the defense who's going to have that opportunity to poke holes and to challenge the theory of the prosecution and really, hang their hat on, we don't have a body. And we have, a married man who has children with this woman who panicked, and he's taken responsibility through the pleas for the pleas that he did today for his part, but that's where his part ends. And so this is going to be really interesting if this does proceed, as how these parts play out.
And we understand from our Penny Commit, who's in the courtroom, that his mother is back in the courtroom. She has some involvement here that will be part of the prosecution and the defense. I know the judge had talked about having the jurors not watch any news during a trial. Whenever I hear something like that, I think, how hard is that to enforce and expect?
We expect the jurors, they take an oath that they are going to follow the court's orders, that they're going to deliver justice. They're going to hear the evidence as impartially as they can and weigh all the evidence and make a decision based upon the evidence. And so we ask jurors in many cases not, especially cases that have this kind of media coverage, to not access social media, to not talk to people about this case. I mean, we give that instruction in general. Don't talk to family members or friends about your role as a juror and what you're doing in this case, because we want to protect the integrity of the juror mindset and that they are to hear things impartially. And I would say that people honor it. And if they don't, we tend to find out about it, as we did with Karen Reed's case. She had a juror excused because they acknowledged that they had, been talking and reading newspaper reports about the trial. And so every day of the trial, the judge is going to ask the juror, have you spoken to anybody? Have you read anything? And the jurors, in my experience, are honest about that. And so we typically do find out about it.
Yeah. And just to refresh people on the backstory and the timeline of this, Brian and Anna Walshe hosted a New Year's Eve party at their home December 31st, 2022. She told him, according to him, he said that she said she had to fly to Washington, D.C. for a work trip early January 1st. That, according to investigators, was the last time she was seen, but it was almost a week before Cohasset police put out a notice for a missing woman. I believe it was January 6th when they finally did that. Is there anything about that gap in 5 days that's unusual in a missing persons case, Jennifer?
Well, a person can't go missing until someone reports them as missing. And here it took, I think it was until January 4th for Anna's employer to say she didn't show up for work when she was expected to. So it's not unusual to have a longer period of time between somebody going missing or logically having, being last seen and actually getting reported to the police, particularly for an adult. It's not, for a child, we would jump on this much more quickly. Presumably, a parent or a friend or a school would notice. But for an adult, it's not that uncommon. But that 5-6 day delay doesn't help the prosecution, right? And we see that. That's why they're missing some evidence that, the prosecution's theories that he disposed of her body in dumpsters, and that those dumpsters, just by regular trash pickup, were taken and incinerated. So evidence was lost as a result of that delay. And that is what we find happens. The longer the delay, the more likely it is that evidence is going to be compromised, as it appears to have been here.
For any viewers that might be joining us here at a quarter before the top of the hour, the headline this morning is that Brian Walshe has changed his plea from not guilty to guilty on the two lesser charges, misleading a police investigation and conveying a dead body. Question for you, Jennifer. Why can't someone plead guilty to first-degree murder?
It's statutory. So our law says that when you have the possibility of a life sentence without parole, you are not allowed to plead guilty to that, and you are entitled to an automatic appeal. So it is written into our laws that way.
Fascinating. But as you had mentioned earlier, the possibility now of further plea agreements between the defense and prosecution, which were really wedged open, if you will, by the guilty plea on these two lesser charges, correct?
Yes, for sure.
Yeah. Interesting.
So at this point, the lesser charge will mean the possibility of parole for Brian Walshe. That is sort of, it seems, the strategy that is the one thing he can hold on to if the prosecution has so much evidence. And Jennifer, as jury selection gets underway, in this case, compared to others, about how long do you estimate jury selection will take?
I think we're going to see a longer jury impanelment than what we would typically see in a murder case, given the high-profile nature of this crime, given the actual nature of the allegations, even that she was a mother, they were married. I mean, that touches a lot of emotional spots for people. And so both sides are going to want to be really careful about impaneling a jury that can truly be unbiased and impartial in this case. So I think it wouldn't be unexpected to have a 2-week jury impanelment for this case. With the goal is to get 16 potential jurors, so there can be 12 on the jury, 2 alternates, and then 2 backups to those alternates.
And of course, if and when the trial does begin, it's expected to be lengthy. It's expected to be costly, potentially up to 100 witnesses called to testify. What's the strategy with having so many witnesses?
Yeah, I think that is part of the prosecution's methodical piecing together of these puzzle pieces. Yeah. I think it appears that a lot of people have touched some part of this case. So we're going to see a lot of experts. Right, we're going to see experts who analyzed the blood on the carpet that the prosecution alleges was removed from the Walshe home during their investigation. We're going to have another expert who can talk about the bone fragment that was found in one of the dumpsters. We're going to have people who talk about the personal belongings having belonged to Anna Walshe, her purse, her necklace that she was known to wear, a pair of hunter boots, her COVID vaccine card, all of those little things. We need different people to place on Anna's person and to say, yes, that is a necklace that she typically wore. That was the purse that she typically carried, or that I've seen her carry on multiple occasions. So all of that sort of circumstantial evidence requires different people to touch it and to explain it. We're probably also going to hear testimony from her employer and maybe fellow coworkers about what kind of employee she was, what kind of colleague she was, because the prosecution wants to debunk any theory that she would have just up and left her children, or that she was somehow unreliable, or maybe was suffering from some type of addiction issues or something, anything that the defense could possibly rely on to try to poke holes in the prosecution's case. The prosecution's going to want to get ahead of that, and that's going to require several witnesses.